Good evening, dear friend. Come now, settle yourself gently into comfort and let the cares of the day fall away like autumn leaves drifting to the ground. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about dreams and distances, about how humanity once looked upward toward the stars and decided to reach out across the impossible darkness of space. This is a story about competition and achievement, about two great nations racing toward the heavens during a time when the world was divided by fear and ideology. But it is also a story about the quiet wonder of discovery, about engineers and scientists and astronauts who worked with dedication and courage to accomplish things that had never been done before. As you rest here in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and steadily, let yourself drift back through time with me, back to the years following the Second World War, when the space race was just beginning to take shape in the minds of visionaries and the plans of governments. The year is 1945, and the Great War that has consumed much of the world is finally coming to an end. Europe lies in ruins, its cities devastated by years of bombing and battle, its people exhausted by conflict and loss. In Germany, as Allied forces advance from both east and west, they discover something unexpected among the rubble and chaos. Hidden in underground facilities and scattered across the German countryside, they find the remnants of an advanced rocket program, technology far beyond what most of the world had developed, weapons that had rained down on London and other cities in the final desperate years of the war. These are the V-2 rockets, sleek missiles that could climb to the edge of space before falling back to Earth with devastating force. They represent the work of German scientists and engineers who had been forced to serve the Nazi war machine, brilliant minds whose knowledge of rocketry and propulsion had produced machines that seemed almost like science fiction made real. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the American and Soviet soldiers who discovered these rockets and the facilities where they were built. Both nations immediately understood that this technology represented something valuable, something that could be important for the future. The United States and the Soviet Union, allies during the war but already beginning to view each other with suspicion and concern, both moved quickly to capture as much of the German rocket technology as possible. They gathered up the physical rockets themselves, studying the metal and mechanisms, trying to understand how these machines worked. They also sought out the scientists and engineers who had built them, offering them new homes and new purposes in either America or the Soviet Union. The most famous of these German rocket scientists was Wernher von Braun, a man who had dreamed of space travel since childhood, who had read science fiction stories about journeys to the Moon and Mars, but who had spent the war years building weapons for Hitler's regime. Von Braun and many of his colleagues surrendered to American forces, and they were brought to the United States, where they would eventually become central figures in America's space program. The moral complexity of welcoming these men, some of whom had used slave labor from concentration camps to build their rockets, would trouble many people. But in the practical calculations of the Cold War that was beginning, both superpowers decided that the value of the technology and expertise outweighed other considerations. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, captured its own share of German rocket scientists and hardware, though not as many as the Americans managed to secure. Soviet engineers studied the V-2 rockets carefully, taking them apart and understanding every component, every system, every principle that made them work. Under the direction of a brilliant Soviet engineer named Sergei Korolev, who would become the chief architect of the Soviet space program, though his name would remain secret for many years, the Soviets began developing their own rocket technology, building on what they had learned from the Germans, but also innovating and improving, creating designs that would eventually carry satellites and cosmonauts into orbit around the Earth. In these early post-war years, as you rest there peacefully, there was no space race yet, no public competition to reach the moon or explore the cosmos. Instead, both nations focused on military applications, on developing rockets that could carry nuclear warheads across continents, on creating intercontinental ballistic missiles that could strike enemy cities with terrible accuracy. The same technology that could lift a satellite into orbit could also deliver a nuclear weapon halfway around the world, and it was this military potential that drove much of the early development. But among the engineers and scientists working on these projects, there were always those who dreamed of something more peaceful, who imagined using rockets not to destroy but to explore, not to threaten but to discover. The Soviet Union made steady progress through the late 1940s and early 1950s, developing larger and more powerful rockets under Korolev's leadership. The Soviets worked in great secrecy, revealing little to the outside world about their capabilities or their plans. The United States, meanwhile, developed its own rocket programs, drawing on the expertise of von Braun and other German scientists who had been integrated into American military research. The Americans were more open about some of their work, though much remained classified for national security reasons. Both nations tested their rockets regularly, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, learning from failures and building on successes, gradually developing the capability to reach higher and farther into the atmosphere. As the 1950s progressed, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union intensified. The world had divided into two camps, one led by the capitalist, democratic United States and the other by the communist, authoritarian Soviet Union. Each side viewed the other as an existential threat, each built enormous military forces, and both developed nuclear weapons in frightening numbers. The competition between these superpowers extended into every area of human endeavor, from military might to economic production, from political influence around the world to achievements in science and technology. And gradually, almost inevitably, this competition began to extend beyond the Earth's atmosphere into the realm that had always existed in human imagination but had never been within human reach, into the vast darkness of space itself. In the Soviet Union, Korolev and his team worked on developing a rocket powerful enough to launch a satellite into orbit. The project was given government approval and resources, though it remained shrouded in secrecy. Korolev was a demanding leader, a man driven by his vision of space exploration, someone who pushed himself and his teams relentlessly to achieve what others thought impossible. He had survived Stalin's purges, had spent years in the brutal Soviet labor camp system, and had emerged with his passion for rocketry not diminished but intensified. Now, in the relative freedom of the post-Stalin era, he worked to turn his dreams into reality, to build machines that could escape the Earth's gravity and venture into the cosmos. The Americans, confident in their technological superiority, worked on their own satellite projects but with less urgency than the Soviets. There was a sense in America that the United States led the world in science and technology, that American innovation and industrial capacity would naturally produce achievements before anyone else could match them. This confidence was not entirely misplaced, as American technology was indeed advanced in many areas, but it led to a certain complacency about the space effort, a belief that there was no need to rush because American success was inevitable. As you breathe slowly and sink deeper into peaceful rest, imagine the contrast between these two programs. In the Soviet Union, intense effort and secrecy, a small group of engineers working under pressure to achieve a breakthrough that would demonstrate Soviet technological prowess to the world. In the United States, multiple competing programs, more openness but perhaps less focus, talented people working on important projects but without the same sense of urgent purpose that drove the Soviet effort. The stage was being set for a surprise that would shock the American government and public, that would mark the beginning of the space race in earnest, that would transform the competition between the superpowers in ways that no one fully anticipated. The late summer of 1957 was passing quietly in most of the world. People went about their daily lives, working and raising families, enjoying the modest prosperity of the post-war years or struggling with the continued hardships that many regions still faced. Few people thought much about space or satellites or what might be possible beyond the Earth's atmosphere. But in a launch facility in the remote steppes of Kazakhstan, Soviet engineers and technicians prepared for something extraordinary, for an attempt to do what had never been done before, to place an artificial object into orbit around the Earth. October 4th, 1957. You can imagine the scene at the Soviet launch facility, a place so remote and secret that its exact location was unknown to most of the world. The massive UP-7 rocket stands vertical on its launch pad, a towering structure of metal and fuel, the culmination of years of work by Korolev and his teams. Attached to the top of this rocket is a small metal sphere, barely 2 feet in diameter, weighing less than 200 pounds, a simple object by the standards of what would come later but revolutionary in what it represented. The sphere is called Sputnik, a Russian word meaning traveler or companion, and it contains radio transmitters that will broadcast a steady beeping signal back to Earth if it successfully reaches orbit. The engineers make their final checks, going through procedures with careful attention to every detail, knowing that so much could go wrong, that rockets were still unpredictable machines that failed as often as they succeeded. The countdown proceeds in Russian, voices calm and professional despite the historic nature of what they are attempting. And then, with a roar of engines and a column of flame, the UP-7 lifts off, rising slowly at first and then faster, climbing into the sky, carrying its small payload upward through the atmosphere. As you rest there peacefully, breathing slowly, you can almost hear the thunder of those engines, can imagine the ground shaking, can picture the rocket becoming smaller as it climbs higher and higher until it disappears from view. Several minutes later, confirmation arrives. Sputnik has separated from the rocket's upper stage. It is in orbit, circling the Earth every 96 minutes, passing over countries and continents, its radio transmitters sending out their rhythmic beep-beep-beep signal that radio operators around the world can detect and confirm. The Soviet Union has placed the first artificial satellite into orbit around the Earth. The space age has begun, and it has begun with a Soviet triumph that catches most of the world, and especially the United States, completely by surprise. News of Sputnik's launch spreads quickly across the globe. In the Soviet Union, the achievement is celebrated as a vindication of the communist system, as proof that Soviet science and technology can match or exceed anything the capitalist West can produce. Newspapers proclaim the victory, and people gather in public squares to look up at the night sky, hoping to catch a glimpse of the satellite as it passes overhead, though most can only see it as a faint moving point of light. The success belongs officially to the collective Soviet effort, though Korolev himself remains anonymous, his name not revealed to the public, his crucial role kept secret by a government that prefers to attribute achievements to the system rather than to individuals. In the United States, the reaction to Sputnik is profound shock and concern. Americans had assumed that their country led the world in science and technology, that any major breakthrough would naturally come from American laboratories and factories. The realization that the Soviet Union has achieved this historic first strikes at American confidence and pride. Newspaper headlines announce the Soviet achievement in large type, and editorial pages fill with worried commentary about what Sputnik means for American security and American standing in the world. If the Soviets can launch a satellite into orbit, people reason, they can also launch nuclear warheads on missiles that could reach American cities. The same rocket that carried Sputnik could carry a weapon of terrible destruction. Political leaders in Washington scramble to respond, to reassure the public, to explain how this happened and what America will do about it. President Dwight Eisenhower, a cautious man who had led Allied forces in Europe during World War II, tries to downplay the significance of Sputnik, suggesting it is merely a scientific achievement with limited practical importance. But many Americans are not reassured. They see Sputnik as evidence that America is falling behind, that the Soviet Union might be surpassing the United States in the technological competition that seems so crucial to survival in the nuclear age. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the mixture of wonder and fear that Sputnik created. Wonder at the achievement itself, at humanity's first successful venture into space, at the idea of a machine circling the Earth above the atmosphere, able to see the planet from a perspective no human had ever experienced. But also fear about what this might mean, about Soviet capabilities and intentions, about whether America was safe, about whether the comfortable assumptions of American technological superiority had been based on illusion rather than reality. The Soviet Union, capitalizing on the success and the American reaction, launched a second satellite just 1 month later. Sputnik 2 was much larger than the first, weighing over 1,000 pounds, and it carried a living passenger, a dog named Laika. This second launch demonstrated that the first had not been a lucky accident but rather the beginning of a sustained program, and it showed that the Soviets could launch much heavier payloads than the small sphere of Sputnik 1. The fact that Sputnik 2 carried a living creature also pointed toward the eventual possibility of human spaceflight, though Laika herself would not survive the mission, as the satellite had no capability to return her safely to Earth. The American response to Sputnik involved both immediate attempts to launch satellites of their own and longer-term reorganization of the space effort. The immediate attempts ended in embarrassment when the first American satellite launch, using a Vanguard rocket, exploded on the launch pad in December 1957, the rocket rising only a few feet before falling back and erupting in flames. The failure was broadcast on television, shown around the world, seeming to confirm that America lagged significantly behind the Soviet Union in space technology. The explosion became a symbol of American difficulties, though it was followed within weeks by a successful satellite launch using a different rocket, the Jupiter C developed by von Braun's team, which placed the Explorer 1 satellite into orbit in January 1958. Explorer 1 was much smaller than Sputnik 2, weighing only about 30 pounds, but it carried scientific instruments that made an important discovery about the Earth's magnetic field and the radiation belts that surround the planet. This was the beginning of space science, the use of satellites not just as demonstrations of technological capability but as platforms for learning about the environment beyond the Earth's atmosphere. Still, the achievement felt overshadowed by Soviet successes, by the fact that the Soviets had been first and had launched larger satellites. The Sputnik crisis, as it came to be called, prompted deep self-examination in the United States. Politicians and commentators questioned American education, particularly in science and mathematics, wondering if American schools were producing enough skilled scientists and engineers to compete with the Soviet Union. The result was a massive increase in federal funding for education, particularly in technical fields, and the creation of new programs to identify and nurture talented students interested in science and engineering. The crisis also led to fundamental changes in how America organized its space efforts. In July 1958, President Eisenhower signed legislation creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, known as NASA, a civilian agency that would coordinate American space efforts and pursue both scientific research and space exploration. NASA absorbed several existing research organizations, including the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which had conducted aviation research for decades, and it was given a broad mandate to develop space capabilities and pursue ambitious goals. The creation of NASA represented America's institutional response to Sputnik, an acknowledgement that space was important enough to require dedicated resources and focused effort. As you rest quietly, breathing slowly and peacefully, you can understand how Sputnik transformed the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, how it took the Cold War rivalry and extended it into a new domain, how it created a race that would capture global attention and drive both nations to attempt extraordinary achievements. The space race had begun in earnest now, sparked by a small beeping sphere circling the Earth, fueled by pride and fear and the human desire to explore and achieve, about to accelerate into a competition that would produce both tragedy and triumph in the years ahead. NASA began operations in October 1958, exactly 1 year after Sputnik's launch, and it quickly set about organizing America's space efforts with several ambitious programs. There would be Project Mercury, aimed at putting an American astronaut into space. There would be satellite programs for weather observation, communications, and scientific research. There would be development of more powerful rockets to lift heavier payloads into orbit and eventually to send spacecraft to the moon and beyond. The engineers and scientists recruited by NASA came from industry, academia, and the military, bringing together expertise from across American society for a common purpose. The Soviet program, meanwhile, continued under Korolev's leadership, working on ever more ambitious projects while maintaining the secrecy that had characterized their effort from the beginning. The Soviet people celebrated their space achievements but knew little about how they were accomplished or who was responsible. Korolev remained anonymous, referred to only as the chief designer in the rare public mentions of the Soviet space program's leadership. This secrecy had advantages, allowing failures to be hidden and preventing adversaries from learning too much about Soviet capabilities, but it also meant that the human faces behind the achievements remained mostly unknown. Both nations were now racing toward the same goal, to be the first to put a human being into space, to achieve what would be the most dramatic demonstration yet of space capability, to show that a person could survive the launch into orbit, the time in space, and the return to Earth. This would require solving enormous technical challenges, protecting the astronaut or cosmonaut from the hostile environment of space, bringing them safely home through the searing heat of re-entry into the atmosphere, and doing it all with enough reliability that the risks could be considered acceptable. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, you can imagine the growing sense of urgency and purpose in both the American and Soviet space programs. Engineers worked long hours designing spacecraft and solving the countless technical problems that stood between concept and reality. In the United States, the 7 men selected to be America's first astronauts became public figures, their names and faces known across the country. They were all military test pilots, chosen for their experience, their skill, and their ability to remain calm under pressure. Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, and Deke Slayton became known as the Mercury 7, and they trained intensively for flights that would last only minutes but would require them to be prepared for anything that might go wrong. The Mercury spacecraft was a small capsule, barely large enough for one person in a pressure suit, designed to sit atop a rocket and be launched into space before returning to Earth by parachute and splashdown in the ocean. Every system had to be tested and retested, every component examined for flaws, every procedure practiced until it became automatic. The astronauts trained in centrifuges that simulated the intense gravitational forces they would experience during launch and reentry. They practiced in simulators that replicated the spacecraft's controls and instruments. They studied astronomy and orbital mechanics, learning the mathematics and physics that govern spaceflight. And they waited, preparing themselves mentally for the moment when they would be called upon to risk their lives in the pursuit of this national goal. In the Soviet Union, a similar selection and training process was underway, though conducted in complete secrecy. 20 young military pilots were chosen to become cosmonauts, as the Soviets called their space travelers. They too underwent intensive training, preparing for flights in the Vostok spacecraft that Korolev's team was developing. The Vostok was somewhat larger than Mercury, a spherical capsule with room for one cosmonaut, designed to be launched by a modified version of the same Art-7 rocket that had carried Sputnik into orbit. Like the Americans, the Soviets tested their systems carefully, conducting unmanned test flights with instrumentation and even with dogs, gradually building confidence that the spacecraft could protect its occupant and return them safely to Earth. Both programs experienced setbacks and delays. Rockets failed during tests, sometimes spectacularly, erupting in flames on the launch pad or breaking apart in flight. Systems malfunctioned, requiring redesigns and more testing. The work was dangerous even before anyone flew into space, with technicians and engineers sometimes injured or killed in accidents involving volatile rocket fuel or explosive components. But both programs pressed forward, driven by the competition between the superpowers, driven by national pride, driven by the human desire to achieve something unprecedented. As you breathe slowly and rest peacefully, imagine the tension building through 1959 and 1960 as both programs approached readiness for their first manned flights. Neither side knew exactly what the other had accomplished or when they might attempt to launch a human into space. Intelligence agencies on both sides worked to gather information, analyzing photographs, intercepting radio signals, questioning defectors, trying to piece together what the other side was doing. The competition was not just technological but also involved secrecy and intelligence, each side trying to understand the other's capabilities while protecting its own. The Soviets achieved another significant first when they sent a spacecraft around the Moon in January 1959, photographing the far side of the Moon that had never been seen from Earth. Later that year, they successfully impacted a probe on the Moon's surface. These achievements demonstrated that Soviet rocket technology was powerful and reliable enough to send payloads beyond Earth orbit, to navigate across the vast distances of space, to accomplish missions that required precise calculations and careful control. Each Soviet success added to American concerns about falling behind, creating pressure on NASA and on American political leaders to accelerate the space effort and demonstrate comparable achievements. The United States had its own successes, launching increasingly sophisticated satellites, developing the powerful rockets that would be needed for future missions, making progress on the Mercury program. But these achievements seemed incremental compared to Soviet spectaculars, and the American public and press grew impatient for more dramatic demonstrations of American capabilities. The pressure fell particularly on NASA's leaders and on the Mercury astronauts, who became symbols of American hopes to catch up with and surpass Soviet space achievements. In early 1961, both programs were approaching readiness for their first manned space flights. The race to be first, to achieve the historic milestone of putting a human being into orbit around the Earth, had become intense. In the Soviet Union, Korolev pushed his teams to finalize preparations for a manned flight, aware that the Americans might be close to attempting their own launch. In the United States, NASA conducted final tests and simulations, preparing for what they hoped would be America's first manned spaceflight sometime in the spring. The decision of who would fly first on each side came down to a combination of factors including skill, performance in training, and sometimes simply the judgment of those in charge about who was most ready, most capable of handling the enormous responsibility. In the Soviet Union, a young Air Force pilot named Yuri Gagarin was selected from among the cosmonaut candidates. Gagarin was 27 years old, the son of a carpenter, a man whose smile and friendly demeanor had impressed his trainers and superiors. He was not the most experienced pilot among the cosmonauts, but there was something about him, a combination of competence and charm, of courage and humility, that led to his selection for the historic first flight. In the United States, the selection of who would fly first among the Mercury 7 had not yet been finalized, as NASA continued testing and preparation. There was discussion about whether the first flight should be a brief suborbital mission, going up into space and coming back down without completing an orbit around the Earth, or whether America should wait until it could match a full orbital flight. The suborbital approach would be quicker to achieve and less risky, but it would be a lesser achievement than an orbital flight. On the morning of April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin rode in a bus to the launch pad at Baikonur Cosmodrome, the Soviet space facility in Kazakhstan. He wore a bright orange pressure suit and a helmet, and he carried himself with calm confidence despite what must have been tremendous anxiety about what he was about to attempt. The rocket waiting for him was the Vostok vehicle, a modified O-7 with the small spherical capsule perched at its top. Gagarin climbed into the capsule through a small hatch, and technicians sealed him inside, running through final checks and preparations while he waited, monitoring instruments, communicating with ground controllers, preparing himself mentally for the launch. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly, you can imagine Gagarin in those final minutes before launch, alone in that small capsule, knowing that he was about to do something no human had ever done, that he might not survive, that the rocket beneath him might explode or malfunction, that 1,000 things could go wrong, but also knowing that if he succeeded he would achieve something historic, something that would be remembered for generations. The countdown proceeded in Russian, voices calm and professional, and then the rocket's engines ignited with a tremendous roar, and the Vostok lifted off, climbing into the April sky, carrying Yuri Gagarin toward space. The ascent was successful. The rocket performed as designed, lifting the Vostok capsule higher and higher until it reached orbital velocity, and Gagarin became the first human being in space, weightless in his cabin, looking down at the Earth through a small window, seeing the curved horizon and the thin blue line of the atmosphere, the vast dark ocean of space above. He orbited the Earth once, a flight lasting just 108 minutes from launch to landing, experiencing weightlessness, observing the Earth from a perspective no one had known before, reporting his observations and sensations back to ground controllers who listened anxiously, hoping that everything would continue to work correctly. The reentry and landing were automatic, controlled by systems in the spacecraft rather than by Gagarin himself, and they proceeded successfully. The Vostok descended through the atmosphere, slowing from orbital velocity through friction with the air, protected by a heat shield that glowed white-hot from the deceleration. At lower altitude, the capsule's hatch was explosively jettisoned and Gagarin ejected in his seat, separating from the spacecraft and descending by parachute to land safely in a field in the Soviet Union. The capsule itself landed nearby under its own parachute. Both Gagarin and the spacecraft survived intact. News of Gagarin's flight circled the globe almost as quickly as he had circled the Earth. The Soviet Union announced the achievement with pride and celebration, revealing Gagarin's name and face to the world, making him an instant international hero. His youth and his warm smile made him an appealing figure, and his achievement was undeniable. The Soviet Union had once again beaten the United States to a major space milestone, had put the first human in space, had demonstrated technological capability and courage that commanded respect even from adversaries. In the United States, the reaction was a mixture of admiration for the achievement and dismay that America had been beaten again. President John F. Kennedy, who had taken office just 3 months earlier, congratulated the Soviet Union on the successful flight but privately pressed NASA and his advisors about when America would accomplish its own manned spaceflight, about what could be done to catch up and perhaps surpass the Soviet lead. Less than a month later, on May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American in space with a suborbital flight that lasted only 15 minutes, going up and coming back down without orbiting the Earth. It was a successful flight and an important step for the American program, but it was clearly less than what Gagarin had achieved. Shepard's flight demonstrated that America could protect an astronaut during spaceflight and bring him home safely, but it did not close the gap with the Soviets, did not match the drama of an orbital mission. In the weeks following Gagarin's historic flight and Shepard's successful but lesser achievement, President Kennedy pondered what America might do to regain the initiative in the space race, to demonstrate American capability and resolve in a way that would capture the world's imagination and prove that the United States could equal or exceed Soviet achievements. As you rest comfortably, breathing slowly and steadily, imagine the discussions taking place in the White House and in Congress, the questions being asked about what was possible, what resources would be required, What goal might be ambitious enough to inspire the nation while still being achievable? Kennedy met with his advisors, with leaders of NASA, with scientists and engineers who understood the technical challenges of spaceflight. They discussed various possibilities. Perhaps a space station orbiting the Earth? But the Soviets might achieve that first as well. Perhaps a mission around the Moon? Possible, but still the kind of achievement the Soviets might match quickly. And then someone raised the most ambitious possibility of all, landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely to Earth. This would be extraordinarily difficult, far more complex than anything either nation had yet accomplished. It would require developing enormous rockets, mastering techniques of spaceflight that had never been attempted, solving thousands of technical problems. But precisely because it was so difficult, it might be a goal where American resources and innovation could make the difference, where the United States could commit itself to an achievement so monumental that success would demonstrate American preeminence. Kennedy was drawn to the moon landing as a goal. It was clear and unambiguous. There would be no question about who had achieved it or whether one nation's accomplishment exceeded another's. Either you landed on the moon or you didn't. And the timeline Kennedy was considering, accomplishing it before the end of the 1960s, would give America nearly a decade to marshal resources and solve problems, time enough that success seemed possible if the commitment was serious. On May 25, 1961, just 20 days after Alan Shepard's flight and barely 6 weeks after Gagarin's orbital mission, President Kennedy addressed a joint session of Congress and, through television and radio, the American people. In measured tones that you can almost hear as you rest there peacefully, Kennedy outlined his vision for American space achievement. He spoke of the challenges facing the nation, of the competition with the Soviet Union, of the importance of leadership in science and technology. And then he made his historic commitment, stating that America should set as its goal, before the decade was out, landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. This was an extraordinary promise, made at a time when America had accomplished exactly 15 minutes of manned spaceflight, when NASA was still learning the basics of how to keep a human being alive in space, when the rockets needed for such a mission did not exist even on drawing boards. Kennedy acknowledged the enormity of what he was proposing, noting that it would require enormous resources, years of effort, new technology and capabilities. But he presented it as a challenge worthy of the nation, something that would require the best of American innovation and determination. The reaction to Kennedy's moon speech was mixed. Some embraced the vision enthusiastically, seeing it as exactly the kind of bold leadership America needed. Others questioned the cost and wisdom of spending billions of dollars on space while pressing needs existed on Earth, while poverty and inequality persisted, while schools and infrastructure required investment. But Kennedy's proposal gained political support, helped by the sense that America needed to demonstrate its capabilities against Soviet competition, that falling behind in space might have implications for American security and prestige that went beyond the space race itself. NASA began planning for what would become the Apollo program, the organized effort to fulfill Kennedy's promise and land Americans on the Moon. The scale of what would be required was staggering. New rockets would need to be developed, far more powerful than anything that existed. A spacecraft capable of traveling to the Moon, landing on its surface, and returning to Earth would need to be designed and built. Astronauts would need to be trained for missions lasting days rather than minutes or hours. Tracking and communication systems would need to be created to maintain contact with spacecraft across the vast distance to the Moon. Launch facilities would need to be expanded to handle the enormous rockets. And all of this would need to be accomplished reliably enough that astronauts could be sent with reasonable confidence they would return alive. As you breathe slowly and sink deeper into peaceful rest, imagine the transformation that began in the American space program following Kennedy's Moon commitment. NASA's budget increased dramatically, eventually reaching more than 4% of the entire federal budget by the mid-1960s. Facilities expanded across the country. The Kennedy Space Center in Florida grew into a massive launch complex. The Johnson Space Center in Houston became the training ground for astronauts and mission control for space flights. The Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, directed by Wernher von Braun, focused on rocket development. Contractors across the country competed for contracts to build components of the spacecraft and rockets, and thousands of companies eventually contributed parts and expertise to the Apollo program. The Soviet Union watched Kennedy's Moon commitment with interest and concern. They had been leading the space race, achieving firsts that America could only follow. But the American commitment to the Moon represented a challenge and a threat. The Soviets had their own plans for lunar missions, had been working on designs for moon rockets and spacecraft, but they had not made the kind of all-encompassing national commitment that Kennedy had announced. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev approved continuation of the Soviet lunar program, but he did not match Kennedy's public commitment or provide resources on the same scale. The Soviet program remained divided among competing design bureaus, lacked the unified focus of Apollo, and struggled with political and bureaucratic obstacles that the American program largely avoided. Through 1961 and 62, both programs continued their work. The United States flew more Mercury missions, each one building on previous experience, each one a step toward the capabilities that would be needed for the Moon. John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth in February 1962, flying 3 orbits aboard Friendship 7 and receiving a hero's welcome when he returned. His flight helped reassure Americans that the space program was making progress, that the gap with the Soviets was narrowing. The Soviets continued their own achievements, flying longer missions, launching 2 Vostok capsules simultaneously and having them rendezvous. OUs in orbit though without actually docking, demonstrating capabilities that pointed toward future space stations and lunar missions. In June 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space, orbiting the Earth for nearly 3 days and adding another first to the Soviet list of space achievements. Behind these public successes and celebrations, both programs experienced setbacks and tragedies that tested the resolve of everyone involved. In the United States, astronauts pushed for changes to spacecraft designs that they believed would make them safer and more functional, sometimes clashing with engineers who resisted modifications that would delay schedules or add weight. In the Soviet Union, Korolev struggled with political pressures and competing priorities, with demands that he accomplish dramatic achievements quickly even when he knew that rushing increased risks. The competition between the two nations remained intense, but it was also becoming clear that the nature of the race was changing. The Soviets had won most of the early milestones, but the Apollo program represented an American commitment to a goal so ambitious that Soviet leaders had to decide whether to try to match it. The resource requirements for reaching the moon were enormous, and the Soviet economy, while growing, could not easily match American spending on space while also maintaining its military forces and supporting its allies around the world. President Kennedy would not live to see the fulfillment of his moon vision. He was assassinated in Dallas in November 1963, shocking the nation and the world, ending a presidency that had lasted less than 3 years. But his successor, Lyndon Johnson, maintained the commitment to Apollo, declaring that the program would continue as a memorial to Kennedy's vision and as a demonstration of American capability. The moon program had Kennedy's name attached to it, but it would be carried forward by others. As you rest quietly, breathing peacefully, you can understand how the space race had evolved by the mid-1960s into something more focused and purposeful than the early competition of spectacular firsts. It had become a sustained effort by both nations to accomplish something unprecedented, to reach beyond Earth and establish human presence in space. The Soviets still achieved notable firsts, including the first spacewalk by Alexei Leonov in March 1965, though that mission nearly ended in disaster when Leonov's suit inflated in the vacuum of space and he struggled to get back inside the spacecraft. The United States transitioned from Mercury to a new program called Gemini, flying two-person spacecraft that allowed astronauts to practice the techniques they would need for Apollo missions. Gemini astronauts learned to rendezvous and dock with other spacecraft in orbit, to spacewalk and work outside their capsules, to stay in space for up to 2 weeks at a time. These missions were stepping stones, each one teaching lessons and building confidence, each one bringing NASA closer to the capability needed for a lunar landing. The development of the Saturn V rocket, the enormous vehicle that would carry Apollo missions to the moon, proceeded under von Braun's direction. This rocket would stand 36 stories tall, generate 7.5 million pounds of thrust at launch, and be capable of lifting the Apollo spacecraft and its crew on a trajectory toward the moon. The Saturn V represented the culmination of everything von Braun had learned about rocketry, from his early experiments in Germany through the V-2 and American missile programs. It would be the most powerful rocket ever built, and its success was essential to Apollo's success. As the Gemini program concluded and Apollo preparations intensified, you can imagine the growing sense that the space race was approaching its climax, that the years of competition and development were leading toward a decisive moment when one nation or the other would achieve the moon landing that had become the defining goal. The mid-1960s brought both progress and setbacks to both space programs, moments of triumph and moments of tragedy that reminded everyone involved that spaceflight was dangerous, that the technology was complex and unforgiving, that the margin between success and catastrophe could be very thin. In the Soviet Union, the lunar program struggled with technical challenges and political complications. Korolev's health was declining, the stress and intensity of his work taking a toll on a man who had already survived years in Stalin's labor camps and who drove himself relentlessly in pursuit of his space dreams. In January 1966, Korolev underwent what was supposed to be routine surgery, but complications arose and he died on the operating table. His death was a devastating blow to the Soviet space program, removing the visionary leader who had guided all their major achievements, the man who understood both the technical details and the political navigation required to keep the program moving forward. The Soviet lunar program lost momentum after Korolev's death. His successors were talented engineers, but they lacked his vision and his ability to unite competing elements of the Soviet space effort. The N-1 rocket, the Soviet equivalent of the Saturn V that was supposed to carry cosmonauts to the moon, experienced repeated failures in testing. The first test launch in February 1969 would end with the rocket breaking apart shortly after liftoff. Subsequent test launches would also fail, and the Soviet Union would eventually abandon the N-1 program without ever achieving a successful flight. In the United States, the Apollo program proceeded with methodical intensity, following a step-by-step approach to developing and testing the systems needed for a lunar landing. The Apollo spacecraft consisted of two main parts: the command and service module where astronauts would spend most of their time, and the lunar module that would descend to the moon's surface with two astronauts while the third remained in orbit in the command module. Each system required extensive testing, both on the ground and in space, to verify that it would work correctly when astronauts' lives depended on it. As you breathe slowly and rest peacefully, you can sense the careful progression of testing and preparation, the countless hours of work by engineers and technicians, the simulations where astronauts practiced every phase of a lunar mission until procedures became automatic, the reviews and checks and double checks meant to catch problems before they could cause catastrophe. But despite all this care, tragedy struck the Apollo program in January 1967, reminding everyone involved of the risks they were accepting. The first manned Apollo mission, designated Apollo 1, was scheduled to launch in February 1967. 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were conducting a launch rehearsal test on the pad, sitting in their spacecraft atop an unfueled rocket, going through the procedures they would follow on launch day. The cabin was pressurized with pure oxygen, a design choice that saved weight but also created a serious fire hazard. During the test, an electrical spark ignited materials inside the cabin, and fire erupted with terrifying speed in the oxygen-rich atmosphere. The astronauts tried to open the hatch, but it was designed to open inward, and the increasing pressure from the fire made it impossible to move. They died within seconds, overcome by toxic gases before the flames could reach them. By the time technicians outside could open the hatch, all three were gone. The loss was devastating to NASA, to the families of the astronauts, to the nation. These were not nameless casualties, but men whose faces and voices had been known to the public, who had trained for years for missions they would never fly, who died not in the glory of spaceflight but in a preventable accident on the ground. The Apollo 1 fire led to extensive investigation and to major redesigns of the spacecraft. The pure oxygen atmosphere was retained for space but replaced with a safer mixture for ground testing. Materials inside the cabin were changed to be less flammable. The hatch was redesigned to open outward and to be operable quickly. Procedures were reviewed and improved. The tragedy delayed the Apollo program by more than a year, but it also made the spacecraft safer and reinforced the seriousness with which risks needed to be addressed. By late 1967, as investigations concluded and spacecraft were modified, the Apollo program resumed with renewed determination. The first flights would be unmanned tests of the Saturn V rocket and the spacecraft systems. Apollo 4 in November 1967 successfully tested the Saturn V, the enormous rocket performing flawlessly on its first flight, validating years of development and giving confidence that it could do what was required. Additional tests followed through 1968, each one verifying systems and capabilities. In October 1968, Apollo 7 became the first manned Apollo mission, a successful 11-day flight in Earth orbit that tested the command and service module and proved that the spacecraft could support astronauts for the duration of a lunar mission. The crew conducted live television broadcasts from space, showing Americans what it was like inside a spacecraft in orbit, bringing space exploration into living rooms across the country in a way that previous missions had not been able to do. The success of Apollo 7 cleared the way for an even more ambitious mission that would end 1968 with a spectacular achievement and would bring the moon suddenly, dramatically closer than it had seemed just months before. NASA decided that Apollo 8 would not merely orbit the Earth but would fly all the way to the Moon, orbit it 10 times, and return to Earth. This would be the first time humans had traveled beyond Earth orbit, the first time anyone would see the Moon from close range, the first time Earth itself would be visible as a distant sphere in space. On December 21, 1968, Apollo 8 launched from Kennedy Space Center with 3 astronauts aboard: Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. The Saturn V performed perfectly, lifting the spacecraft into Earth orbit and then reigniting to send it on a trajectory toward the Moon. For 3 days, the astronauts coasted across the vast emptiness between Earth and Moon, watching the Earth shrink behind them and the Moon grow larger ahead, experiencing what no humans had experienced before, this journey away from the home planet into the void. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, imagine the Apollo 8 astronauts seeing the Earth from hundreds of thousands of miles away, seeing it as a blue and white sphere hanging in the black of space, seeing clouds and oceans and the suggestion of continents, seeing the whole planet at once in a way that makes borders and divisions invisible, that emphasizes the unity of Earth and the isolation of humanity's home in the vast cosmos. This view would produce one of the most famous photographs ever taken, Earthrise, showing the Earth rising above the lunar horizon, an image that would help inspire the environmental movement and change how humanity thought about the planet. Apollo 8 reached the Moon on Christmas Eve and fired its engine to slow down and enter lunar orbit. For the next 20 hours, the astronauts orbited the Moon, looking down at its ancient, cratered surface, at the mountains and plains that no human eyes had seen from this perspective before. They conducted live television broadcasts, describing what they were seeing, and on Christmas Eve they took turns reading from the book of Genesis, the creation story, a moment of reflection and wonder that resonated with the hundreds of millions of people watching and listening around the world. The return journey began when Apollo 8 fired its engine again to escape lunar orbit and head back toward Earth. The astronauts coasted home across the same vast distance, and on December 27 they re-entered Earth's atmosphere at tremendous speed, protected by their heat shield from temperatures that would otherwise have vaporized the spacecraft. They splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean, having completed a mission that demonstrated that NASA could send astronauts to the Moon and bring them home, that the technology and procedures were sound, that a lunar landing was within reach. The success of Apollo 8 transformed 1968 from a year that had been marked by turmoil and tragedy, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, the violence of the Vietnam War, into a year that could end with hope and achievement. It showed that the Apollo program was on track, that Kennedy's goal of landing on the Moon before the end of the decade was possible. And it provided a moment of unity and inspiration when the nation badly needed both. In the Soviet Union, the success of Apollo 8 made clear that the United States was now leading the race to the Moon, that American determination and resources had produced capabilities that the Soviets could not match. The Soviet lunar program continued, and Soviet officials publicly downplayed American achievements while maintaining that they had never been racing to land cosmonauts on the Moon. But privately, Soviet space planners understood that they were unlikely to beat the Americans to the lunar surface. The path to a lunar landing now seemed clear. NASA would fly additional Apollo missions through the spring and summer of 1969, each one testing additional systems and procedures. Apollo 9 would test the lunar module in Earth orbit, verifying that it could separate from the command module, maneuver independently, and dock again. Apollo 10 would conduct a full-dress rehearsal of a lunar landing mission, flying to the Moon and descending in the lunar module to within 9 miles of the surface before returning to the command module and coming home. And then, if all went well, Apollo 11 would attempt the actual landing. The spring of 1969 brought the final preparations for what would be the climactic mission of the space race, the attempt to land astronauts on the Moon and fulfill President Kennedy's vision. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, you can imagine the intensive activity at NASA centers across the country, the final tests and simulations, the careful review of everything that had been learned from previous missions, the awareness that the world would be watching and that success or failure would have implications far beyond space exploration itself. Apollo 9 flew in March, a successful 10-day mission in Earth orbit where astronauts tested the lunar module for the first time with crew aboard, verifying that it could separate from the command module, operate independently in space with its own life support and propulsion systems, and dock again with the command module. The lunar module looked strange compared to traditional aircraft or spacecraft, an ungainly vehicle that would never fly in atmosphere and therefore didn't need streamlining or wings, just a descent stage with its own engine and landing legs, and an ascent stage where astronauts would ride, with its own engine to lift them back off the moon to rendezvous with the command module for the journey home. Apollo 10 followed in May, flying to the moon and conducting what NASA called a full-dress rehearsal of everything except the actual landing. Astronauts Tom Stafford and Eugene Cernan descended in the lunar module to within 9 miles of the lunar surface, verifying navigation and communication systems, proving that the lunar module could perform as required, while John Young remained in the command module in orbit above. The mission returned successfully after 8 days, and NASA announced that Apollo 11 would attempt the landing. 3 men were selected for Apollo 11, astronauts who had trained together and who trusted each other's abilities. Neil Armstrong would be the mission commander, a civilian test pilot who had flown dangerous experimental aircraft and who was known for his calm competence and his ability to make quick decisions in emergencies. Edwin Buzz Aldrin would be the lunar module pilot, a former Air Force officer with a doctorate in orbital mechanics, someone who understood the mathematics of spaceflight as deeply as anyone in the program. Michael Collins would be the command module pilot, a former Air Force test pilot who would remain in orbit while Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the surface, who would have the lonely responsibility of waiting and hoping for their safe return. Through June and early July, these 3 astronauts trained intensively, practicing in simulators, reviewing procedures, preparing themselves mentally for the mission. The spacecraft and rocket were assembled and tested at Kennedy Space Center, with technicians working carefully through extensive checklists, verifying every system, making sure everything was ready. A launch date was set, July 16, 1969. As you rest peacefully, breathing slowly and steadily, imagine the days leading up to launch, the growing excitement around the world, the awareness that history was about to be made. Reporters from dozens of countries descended on Florida to cover the launch. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered along nearby beaches and roads, hoping to witness the Saturn V liftoff. In homes across America and around the world, people prepared to watch on television, knowing that they were about to see something extraordinary. On the morning of July 16th, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were awakened early, ate a traditional astronaut breakfast of steak and eggs, and suited up in their bulky white spacesuits. They rode to the launch pad in a van, looking up at the Saturn V rocket towering above them, 36 stories of metal and fuel and machinery that would carry them away from Earth. They took an elevator to the top and climbed into the command module, lying on their backs in their seats, technicians sealing the hatch behind them. And then they waited as the countdown proceeded, as thousands of checks were completed, as the world watched and held its breath. At 9:32 in the morning, the Saturn V's first stage engines ignited with a roar that could be felt miles away, and the enormous rocket began to lift off, rising slowly at first and then faster, climbing into the Florida sky on a pillar of flame, the sound of its engines arriving seconds later as a thunder that washed over the crowds watching from the ground. The rocket performed perfectly, each stage firing in sequence, pushing the spacecraft higher and faster until it reached Earth orbit 99 miles above the surface. After orbiting the Earth 1.5 times, checking systems, and preparing for the next step, the third stage of the Saturn V reignited to send Apollo 11 on its journey toward the Moon. This maneuver, called translunar injection, accelerated the spacecraft to over 24,000 miles per hour, the speed needed to escape Earth's gravity and coast across the void to the Moon. The astronauts then separated the command and service module from the third stage, turned around, docked with the lunar module that had been stored below, and extracted it from its housing. The third stage was jettisoned, sent on a trajectory that would miss the Moon, while Apollo 11 continued on its path. The journey to the Moon took 3 days, the spacecraft coasting silently through space, the Earth shrinking behind it and the Moon growing larger ahead. The astronauts ate and slept on a careful schedule, performed navigation checks, made small course corrections, and communicated regularly with Mission Control in Houston, where flight controllers monitored every aspect of the mission and stood ready to assist with any problems that might arise. As you breathe slowly and sink deeper into rest, you can imagine the strange isolation of that journey, traveling through the vacuum of space in a small capsule, surrounded by emptiness, knowing that the nearest help was hundreds of thousands of miles away. On July 19th, Apollo 11 reached the Moon and fired its main engine to slow down and enter lunar orbit. The astronauts looked down at the ancient surface, at craters and mountains and the flat plains called Maria, preparing themselves for what would come next. They orbited the Moon for a day, making final preparations, sleeping one last time before the landing attempt, reviewing procedures and checking systems. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin moved into the lunar module, which they had named Eagle, while Collins remained in the command module, named Columbia. The two spacecraft separated, and Eagle began its descent toward the surface, firing its engine to reduce speed and drop out of orbit, following a carefully calculated trajectory toward the landing site in the Sea of Tranquility, a relatively flat area that had been chosen because it appeared safe and accessible. The descent was tense. Armstrong and Aldrin monitored their instruments, watching altitude and speed, aware that their lives depended on the lunar module systems working correctly, aware that they had limited fuel and limited time to land before they would have to abort and return to orbit. Mission Control watched anxiously from Houston, analyzing telemetry data, ready to call for an abort if anything seemed wrong but otherwise maintaining silence to avoid distracting the astronauts from their concentration. As Eagle approached the surface, alarms sounded in the cockpit, computer warnings indicating that the guidance system was overloaded with calculations. Mission Control quickly determined that the alarms were not critical, that the computer could continue guiding the descent despite the overload, and they gave clearance to continue. Armstrong looked out his window at the landing site and realized that the computer was taking them toward a field of large boulders where a landing would be dangerous. He took manual control, flying the lunar module like a helicopter, searching for a smoother spot while the fuel gauge dropped lower and lower. With less than 30 seconds of fuel remaining, Armstrong found a suitable spot and set Eagle down gently, the landing leg settling into the lunar dust. The engine shut down, and a tense silence filled the spacecraft before Aldrin quietly said, "Contact light," indicating that probes extending from the landing legs had touched the surface. Armstrong then spoke the words that would be heard around the world, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." In Mission Control, there was an explosion of relief and joy. Controllers who had been holding their breath for tense minutes suddenly celebrating, knowing that the most dangerous part of the mission had been accomplished, that American astronauts had successfully landed on the moon. Around the world, people watching on television or listening to radio broadcasts shared in the moment, understanding that they were witnessing history, that humans had reached another world for the first time. Armstrong and Aldrin spent the next few hours preparing for their moonwalk, scheduled for later that day rather than waiting until the next day as originally planned. They depressurized the lunar module's cabin, opened the hatch, and Armstrong carefully backed out onto a small platform, then descended a ladder to the surface. At the bottom of the ladder, he paused and spoke words that had been carefully considered. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," describing both the physical act of stepping onto the surface and the metaphorical significance of what humanity had achieved. Aldrin joined Armstrong on the surface about 20 minutes later, and the two astronauts spent 2.5 hours outside the lunar module, walking in the moon's weak gravity, collecting rock and soil samples, setting up scientific experiments, taking photographs, and planting an American flag. Their movements were slow and careful, limited by their bulky spacesuits and by the need to avoid falling or damaging their equipment. They described what they were seeing and experiencing to Mission Control and to the watching world, trying to convey the strangeness and beauty of the lunar landscape. As you rest peacefully in the quiet darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can imagine Armstrong and Aldrin moving across the lunar surface, their white spacesuits brilliant against the grey dust and black sky, their footprints marking the ancient soil that had never before been disturbed by human presence. The moon had existed for billions of years, circling the Earth in silent orbit, reflecting sunlight that had inspired poets and philosophers, that had marked the passing of months and seasons for all of human history. And now, for the first time, humans walked upon it, an achievement that seemed almost impossible even to those who had worked for years to make it happen. The moon's surface was covered in a fine, powdery dust that stirred and settled slowly in the weak gravity. Every movement kicked up small clouds of this dust, and it clung to the astronauts' suits, making them look grey rather than white. The landscape was desolate and beautiful in its starkness, without atmosphere or weather to soften the harsh contrasts between light and shadow, without vegetation or water or any sign of life beyond the two human visitors in their carefully engineered suits. Armstrong and Aldrin moved carefully, aware that they were far from help if anything went wrong, that their suits were all that protected them from the vacuum of space and the extreme temperatures that ranged from scorching heat in the sunlight to brutal cold in the shadows. They collected samples of lunar rocks and soil, using tools specially designed to be operated in their bulky gloves, placing samples in bags that would return to Earth for analysis by scientists eager to learn about the Moon's composition and history. They set up several scientific experiments that would remain on the Moon after they departed. A seismometer to detect moonquakes and meteor impacts, helping scientists understand the Moon's internal structure. A laser reflector that would allow precise measurements of the distance between Earth and Moon by reflecting laser beams sent from Earth. These instruments represented the scientific purpose of the mission beyond the achievement of landing itself, the effort to learn about the Moon and use it as a platform for understanding the solar system. The American flag they planted in the soil was held horizontal by a rod along its top edge, since there was no wind on the Moon to make it wave naturally. The flag was symbolic, representing the nation that had accomplished the landing, though a plaque on the lunar module's descent stage carried a different message, stating that humans had come to the Moon in peace for all mankind, emphasizing the achievement as something that belonged to humanity rather than to any single nation. After 2.5 hours of exploration and work on the surface, Armstrong and Aldrin returned to the lunar module, carefully cleaning as much lunar dust as possible from their suits before climbing back inside and sealing the hatch. They repressurized the cabin, removed their helmets and gloves, and rested briefly before preparing for the next critical phase, leaving the Moon and rendezvousing with Collins in the command module orbiting above. Michael Collins, alone in Columbia, had spent anxious hours orbiting the Moon, knowing that Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface but unable to see them or communicate with them when his orbit took him around the far side of the Moon where radio signals could not reach. He had prepared himself for the possibility that the lunar landing might fail, that he might have to return to Earth alone, but he had also maintained faith that his colleagues would succeed and that he would see them again when they launched from the surface. The launch from the Moon was perhaps the most critical moment of the entire mission. The lunar module's ascent stage engine had to fire correctly on the first attempt, as there was no backup and no way to repair it if something went wrong. If the engine failed, Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded on the Moon with no possibility of rescue. But the engine had been designed and tested carefully, and when the moment came, it performed perfectly, lifting the ascent stage off the Moon and into orbit to begin the complex ballet of rendezvous with Columbia. As you breathe slowly and feel yourself sinking deeper into peaceful rest, imagine the relief of everyone involved when that engine fired successfully, when the astronauts on the surface began their journey back to join their colleague in orbit. The rendezvous required careful navigation and timing, small engine firings to adjust trajectory and speed, gradually bringing the two spacecraft together until they could dock and the crew could reunite. After Armstrong and Aldrin transferred back to the command module along with their precious cargo of lunar samples, they jettisoned the lunar module, leaving it to crash back onto the Moon while Columbia prepared for the journey home. The return to Earth took 3 days, another long coast through space, this time with the Moon receding behind them and the Earth growing larger ahead. The astronauts were exhausted but elated, knowing that they had succeeded, that they had accomplished what they set out to do, that they would soon be home. They conducted television broadcasts, answering questions from reporters and showing viewers what life was like aboard the spacecraft, helping the world understand what they had experienced. On July 24, Apollo 11 re-entered Earth's atmosphere at tremendous speed, the heat shield protecting the command module from temperatures that reached 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The spacecraft decelerated rapidly, the astronauts experiencing strong gravitational forces as their speed dropped from thousands of miles per hour to a few hundred. Parachutes deployed at high altitude, slowing the capsule further until it splashed down gently in the Pacific Ocean, where Navy ships were waiting to recover the astronauts and bring them home. The successful completion of Apollo 11 fulfilled President Kennedy's goal with 5 months to spare before the end of the 1960s. The United States had won the race to the Moon decisively, demonstrating technological capability and national will that commanded respect around the world. The Soviet Union acknowledged the American achievement, congratulating NASA and the astronauts, though Soviet media coverage was limited and somewhat downplayed the significance of the landing. For the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts, returning to Earth meant first spending time in quarantine, isolated from other people in case they had somehow brought back lunar microorganisms that might be dangerous to life on Earth. This quarantine period lasted 3 weeks, and it was conducted first on the Navy recovery ship and then in a special facility at Houston. Scientists examined the lunar samples for any signs of life, finding none, confirming that the Moon was truly a dead world without biology. After quarantine ended, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were celebrated as heroes, not just in the United States but around the world. They embarked on a goodwill tour visiting dozens of countries, receiving medals and honors, speaking to crowds of thousands, representing not just themselves or their nation but the achievement of human spaceflight itself. Armstrong in particular, as the first person to walk on the Moon, became one of the most famous people in the world, though he handled the fame with characteristic humility, always emphasizing that Apollo was the work of thousands of people rather than the achievement of any individual. The Moon landing transformed how humanity thought about space and about Earth. The photographs taken during the mission, particularly the image of the Earth rising above the lunar horizon that Apollo 8 had captured the previous year, helped people see the planet as a unified whole, a small blue oasis of life in the vast darkness of space. This perspective contributed to growing environmental awareness, to the understanding that Earth's resources were finite and precious, that national boundaries were human constructions overlaid on a planet that knew no such divisions. The technological achievements required for Apollo had broader impacts beyond space exploration. The miniaturization of electronics needed to fit computers into the spacecraft contributed to the development of modern computing. Materials developed for heat shields and spacesuits found applications in other industries. The management techniques developed to coordinate the enormous Apollo program influenced how large, complex projects were organized in business and government. Thousands of engineers and scientists who worked on Apollo went on to apply their expertise in other fields, spreading the knowledge and capabilities that the space program had developed. In the months and years following Apollo 11, as you rest comfortably and breathe slowly, the Apollo program continued with additional missions to the Moon, each one building on what had been learned, each one exploring different regions of the lunar surface, each one expanding human knowledge about the Moon and demonstrating the capabilities that had been developed. Apollo 12 landed on the Moon in November 1969, touching down with precision near an unmanned surveyor probe that had landed years earlier, proving that astronauts could target specific locations for landing. The crew spent more time on the surface than Armstrong and Aldrin had, conducting 2 moonwalks and collecting more samples. Apollo 13, launched in April 1970, was intended to be the third lunar landing but instead became a dramatic survival story when an oxygen tank exploded in the service module during the journey to the Moon. The explosion crippled the spacecraft, forcing the astronauts to abandon the landing and use the lunar module as a lifeboat for the journey around the Moon and back to Earth. The crew, James Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert, worked with Mission Control to solve a series of life-threatening problems, conserving power and water, jury-rigging systems to remove carbon dioxide from the air, calculating engine burns to correct their trajectory toward Earth. Against considerable odds, they made it home safely, splashing down in the Pacific after a harrowing 4 days in a crippled spacecraft. The successful return demonstrated the value of careful planning, of backup systems, and of the ability to improvise solutions to unexpected problems. Apollo 14 through Apollo 17 completed the lunar landing program between February 1971 and December 1972. Each mission was more ambitious than the previous one, with astronauts spending more time on the surface, traveling farther from their landing sites, collecting more samples, conducting more extensive scientific investigations. The later missions included a lunar rover, a battery-powered vehicle that allowed astronauts to drive across the lunar surface, extending their exploration range and enabling them to visit geologically interesting features that would have been too far to reach on foot. Apollo 15, 16, and 17 were designated J missions, with enhanced scientific capabilities and longer surface stays. The astronauts on these missions included trained geologists who could make informed decisions about which rocks to sample, who could describe geological features with technical precision, who understood the significance of what they were seeing. The samples returned by these missions provided material for scientific study that continued for decades, revealing the Moon's history, its formation from debris created when a Mars-sized object collided with the early Earth billions of years ago, its volcanic past, the bombardment by asteroids and comets that had created its cratered surface. As you breathe slowly and sink deeper into peaceful rest, you can reflect on how the excitement and novelty of moon landings gradually faded in public consciousness. The first landing had captivated the world, with hundreds of millions of people watching on television, but by the later missions the audience had diminished, the achievement seeming almost routine despite the tremendous difficulty and danger involved in each flight. The final mission, Apollo 17 in December 1972, received less media coverage than the first, though it was in many ways the most scientifically productive mission, with geologist Harrison Schmitt conducting detailed studies of the lunar surface and the crew spending more than 3 days on the moon. After Apollo 17, no human has returned to the moon. The program that had been created to win the space race ended once that race was won and political support for continued lunar missions faded. The enormous cost of Apollo, while justified in the context of Cold War competition and national prestige, became harder to sustain once the primary goal had been achieved. Public interest shifted to other concerns, particularly the Vietnam War and domestic social issues, and support for spending billions of dollars on space exploration diminished. The final 3 planned Apollo missions, numbers 18, 19, and 20, were cancelled, the rockets and spacecraft that had been built for them repurposed for other missions or placed in museums. The Soviet Union, having lost the race to the moon, focused its space program on different goals. Soviet cosmonauts established and operated space stations in Earth orbit, learning how humans could live and work in space for extended periods, developing capabilities that would eventually lead to the International Space Station. The Soviets sent robotic probes to the moon that returned small samples to Earth without requiring cosmonauts to make the journey, demonstrating an alternative approach to lunar exploration. And they continued with their human spaceflight program, setting records for duration in space, conducting scientific experiments, maintaining a presence in Earth orbit. The United States also shifted its space program toward new goals after Apollo ended. The Skylab space station, built from a converted Saturn V third stage, was launched in 1973 and hosted 3 crews of astronauts who lived aboard for periods of up to 84 days, conducting scientific research and proving that humans could adapt to long-duration spaceflight. The Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975 brought American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts together in orbit, docking their spacecraft and visiting each other in a symbolic gesture of cooperation that suggested the space race might give way to collaboration. The development of the Space Shuttle, which began in the 1970s and first flew in 1981, represented a new approach to spaceflight, creating a reusable vehicle that could launch like a rocket, operate in orbit like a spacecraft, and land like an airplane. The shuttle would fly more than 100 missions over 30 years, deploying satellites, conducting scientific research, building the International Space Station, but it would also experience 2 catastrophic failures, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, that killed 14 astronauts and demonstrated that spaceflight remained dangerous even as it became more routine. The competition that had driven the space race gradually transformed into cooperation as the Cold War eased and eventually ended with the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. Russia, the Soviet Union's successor state, and the United States began working together on space projects, eventually becoming the two main partners in the International Space Station, a permanently inhabited orbital laboratory that has been continuously occupied since the year 2000. Astronauts and cosmonauts who once represented competing ideologies now live and work together in space, conducting research that benefits all humanity, demonstrating that cooperation can achieve things that competition alone might not. As you rest peacefully, breathing slowly and deeply, completely relaxed, you can appreciate how the space race was both a product of Cold War competition and a catalyst for achievements that transcended that competition. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union drove both nations to accomplish things that might not have been attempted otherwise, to commit resources and effort on a scale that would have been difficult to justify without the pressure of competition. But the achievements themselves, particularly the moon landings and the development of space technology, became part of human heritage rather than merely national accomplishments. The legacy of the space race extends beyond the specific missions and technologies to influence how we think about exploration, about human potential, about our place in the universe. The images of Earth taken from space, the view of our planet as a whole rather than as a collection of separate nations and territories, helped create environmental consciousness and awareness of global interconnection. The achievement of landing on the moon demonstrated that humans could accomplish things that seemed impossible, that with sufficient will and resources even the most ambitious goals could be reached. The scientists and engineers who worked on the space race, on both sides of the competition, advanced human knowledge and capability in ways that extended far beyond space exploration. The development of computers and electronics, of materials and propulsion systems, of navigation and communication technologies, all received enormous impetus from the demands of spaceflight. The mathematical and scientific principles developed for space missions found applications in countless other fields, contributing to advances in medicine, communications, transportation, and manufacturing. The astronauts and cosmonauts who flew into space, who risked their lives to explore beyond Earth, became symbols of human courage and curiosity. Names like Yuri Gagarin and Neil Armstrong, like Valentina Tereshkova and Sally Ride, represent not just individual achievement but collective aspiration, the human desire to explore and understand, to push beyond limits and discover what lies beyond the horizon. These space travelers came from different nations and political systems, but their achievements belong to all humanity, demonstrating capabilities and possibilities that inspire successive generations. As you continue to rest in deep peace, breathing slowly and steadily, your mind calm and quiet, you can reflect on how the space race changed not just technology and politics but also culture and imagination, how it influenced art and literature, how it shaped how people thought about the future and about humanity's place in the cosmos. The 1950s and 60s were a time when science fiction became increasingly popular, with stories of space travel and alien civilizations capturing public imagination, and the reality of actual spaceflight made these stories seem less fantastic, more grounded in possibility. The moon landings in particular created a sense that humanity's future lay in space, that the exploration of the solar system and eventually the stars was not a distant dream but an achievable goal that would unfold in the coming decades. There was optimism in the years immediately following Apollo about what would come next, expectations that moon bases would be established by the 1980s, that missions to Mars would follow soon after, that space travel would become routine and accessible. These expectations have not been fulfilled on the timeline people imagined, as the political will and resources that drove Apollo were not sustained, but the fundamental belief that humans will eventually become a spacefaring species remains strong. The space race also influenced education and career choices for a generation of young people who watched the missions and were inspired to study science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The astronauts and cosmonauts became role models, demonstrating that dedication and hard work could lead to extraordinary achievements. Schools emphasized science and mathematics education, governments funded scholarships and research programs, and universities expanded their engineering and science departments to meet the demand from students who wanted to contribute to space exploration or to the technologies that had emerged from it. The international aspect of the space race, the fact that it captured attention around the world and not just in the competing superpowers, demonstrated humanity's shared interest in exploration and discovery. People in countries that had no space programs of their own followed the missions with fascination, celebrated the achievements, and felt connected to something larger than their own national concerns. The moon landings were watched by people in every inhabited continent, broadcast to remote villages as well as major cities, creating a brief moment of global unity around a shared experience. The photographs and film footage from space missions created visual records that changed how people saw the Earth and space. Before spaceflight, the Earth had never been photographed from space, the Moon had been seen only through telescopes, and space itself was literally a void about which little was known from direct observation. The images sent back by spacecraft, showing Earth as a sphere hanging in darkness, showing the Moon's surface in detail, showing the Sun and stars as they appear from beyond the atmosphere, made space real and accessible in ways that words and imagination alone could not achieve. The famous Earthrise photograph, taken by Apollo 8 astronauts during their Christmas Eve orbit of the Moon in 1968, became one of the most influential images in history. It showed the Earth rising above the lunar horizon, a small blue and white sphere against the black of space, looking fragile and precious and alone. This image has been credited with helping to launch the modern environmental movement, with making people more aware of Earth's finite nature, with creating a sense of the planet as something that needed to be protected and cared for. The economic impact of the space race was substantial, though it has been debated by historians and economists. The United States spent more than $25 billion on the Apollo program alone, equivalent to more than $150 billion in current dollars, an enormous investment that represented a significant portion of the federal budget during the 1960s. Critics argued that this money could have been better spent on addressing poverty, improving education, building infrastructure, and solving social problems on Earth. Supporters argued that the technological advances and economic activity generated by space spending provided returns that justified the investment, that the inspiration and knowledge gained were valuable beyond their immediate economic impact. The reality is probably that both perspectives contain truth. The space race did consume resources that could have been used for other purposes, and the choice to prioritize space exploration over other national needs was a political decision that reflected the priorities of the Cold War era. But the space program also created jobs, supported industries, advanced technology, and inspired innovation in ways that had lasting economic benefits. The question of whether the benefits justified the costs depends partly on how one values intangible returns like knowledge, inspiration, and national prestige compared to more immediate and tangible benefits like reduced poverty or improved infrastructure. The Soviet Union space program operated under different economic conditions and with less public accountability than the American program, making it difficult to assess its economic impact with the same precision. The Soviets spent heavily on their space efforts, though exact figures remain uncertain because the Soviet economy operated differently from market economies and because information about spending was kept secret. The Soviet space program employed hundreds of thousands of people, supported research institutions, and maintained extensive facilities, all of which represented significant resource commitments in an economy that was already struggling to provide consumer goods and maintain living standards. As you breathe slowly and sink even deeper into peaceful rest, you can appreciate that the space race was fundamentally about more than economics or even technology, that it represented a competition of ideas and systems, of democracy versus authoritarianism, of capitalism versus communism. Each superpower used its space achievements to demonstrate the superiority of its political and economic system, to show that its way of organizing society could produce results that the others could not match. The early Soviet successes were presented as validation of communist planning and collective effort, while American achievements were portrayed as products of freedom, innovation, and individual initiative. The end of the space race, which came not with a formal conclusion but with a gradual shift toward cooperation in the 1970s and beyond, coincided with broader changes in the Cold War and eventually with the end of the Soviet system itself. The competition in space never truly ended, but it transformed into something less urgent and less central to the superpower rivalry. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, when Russia emerged as its successor state facing enormous economic and political challenges, cooperation in space became both practically necessary and symbolically important as a way of maintaining ties and preventing the complete dissolution of Russia's space capabilities. The International Space Station, which began construction in 1998 and has been continuously inhabited since the year 2000, represents the transformation from competition to cooperation, from space race to space partnership. American astronauts launch on Russian rockets, Russian cosmonauts train at NASA facilities, and spacecraft from multiple nations dock with the station. The scientific research conducted there benefits all participating countries, and the station itself stands as a symbol of what can be achieved when nations work together rather than competing against each other. Yet even as cooperation has become the norm in some areas of space activity, new forms of competition have emerged. China has developed a sophisticated space program, launching its own space station and landing robotic missions on the Moon, becoming the third nation to independently develop human spaceflight capability. Private companies, particularly in the United States, have entered space launch and satellite markets, creating commercial competition that operates alongside and sometimes in partnership with government programs. The possibility of mining asteroids for minerals, of establishing permanent settlements on the Moon or Mars, of developing space tourism, all represent new frontiers where competition and cooperation will both play roles. The original space race between the United States and the Soviet Union belongs to history now, a chapter that closed decades ago but that continues to influence how we think about space and exploration. The achievements of that era, particularly the moon landings, remain among humanity's greatest accomplishments, demonstrations of what can be achieved when vision and resources and determination align toward a common goal. The technology developed during the space race continues to benefit society in countless ways, from satellite communications that connect the globe to weather forecasting that saves lives to GPS navigation that has become indispensable in daily life. As we approach the end of this long journey through the story of the space race, as you rest in deep comfort and peace, breathing slowly and steadily, your body completely relaxed and your mind quiet and calm, it is time to reflect gently on what this history means, what it teaches us, and how we might carry its lessons forward into an uncertain future where space exploration continues in new forms with new participants pursuing new goals. The space race was born from competition and conflict, from the Cold War rivalry between two superpowers who saw each other as existential threats, who built enormous military forces and nuclear arsenals, who competed for influence around the world. In this context, space became another arena for competition, another way to demonstrate superiority, another front in the global struggle between capitalism and communism, between democracy and authoritarianism. The achievements in space were used as propaganda by both sides, as evidence that their system worked better, that their way of organizing society was superior. But despite these origins in conflict, despite being motivated by competition and rivalry, the space race produced achievements that transcended those origins, that became part of human heritage rather than merely national accomplishments. The first human in space, whether Yuri Gagarin or any other cosmonaut or astronaut, represents a milestone for all humanity, not just for the Soviet Union. The first steps on the Moon, whether taken by Neil Armstrong or anyone else, belong to all people, not just to Americans. These achievements expanded what we knew was possible, changed how we saw ourselves and our planet, inspired wonder and curiosity that crosses all borders and ideologies. The technological challenges of spaceflight required solving problems that had never been solved before, developing capabilities that didn't exist, creating systems that could function in the hostile environment beyond Earth's atmosphere. This work was done by thousands of engineers and scientists and technicians, people who brought their expertise and dedication to tasks that seemed impossible, who persisted through failures and setbacks, who learned from mistakes and built on successes. The space programs of both the United States and Soviet Union were collective achievements, requiring coordination and cooperation among vast numbers of people, bringing together expertise from multiple disciplines, demonstrating what organized human effort can accomplish. The astronauts and cosmonauts who flew into space, who risked their lives to explore beyond Earth, embodied courage and commitment to something larger than themselves. They underwent years of training for flights that might last only hours or days. They accepted risks that were very real and very serious, knowing that spaceflight was dangerous, that systems might fail, that mistakes could be fatal. And they did this not for personal gain but for exploration, for knowledge, for their nations and for humanity. Some of them died in the pursuit of these goals, sacrificing their lives in accidents that reminded everyone involved that space exploration was not a game or a spectacle but a serious endeavor with real consequences. The lessons of the space race extend beyond technology and exploration to questions of leadership, vision, and commitment. President Kennedy's decision to commit America to landing on the moon, made when the technology to accomplish it didn't exist and the outcome was far from certain, represented bold leadership willing to set ambitious goals and mobilize resources to achieve them. Soviet leader Khrushchev's approval of the early space program, his willingness to invest in rocket technology and support Korolev's vision, showed similar willingness to pursue ambitious goals despite uncertainty about outcomes. But leadership alone was not sufficient. The achievements required sustained commitment over years and decades, required resources and expertise and effort that could only come from entire societies dedicating themselves to these goals. The space race showed what can be accomplished when nations commit seriously to objectives, when resources are mobilized, when talented people are given support and freedom to pursue solutions to difficult problems. This lesson remains relevant for any challenge requiring collective effort over extended time, whether addressing climate change, developing new technologies, or solving social problems. The environmental awareness that emerged partly from seeing Earth from space, from the photographs that showed our planet as a unified whole rather than a collection of separate nations, represents another lasting impact of the space race. The perspective of seeing Earth from outside, of recognizing its beauty and fragility, of understanding that we all share this one planet without backup or alternative, has influenced how many people think about environmental protection and sustainability. The space program, created to explore beyond Earth, helped us see Earth itself more clearly and appreciate what we have. As you breathe slowly and rest in deep peace, you can let go of the details and simply hold the wonder of what was achieved, the fact that humans built machines that could escape Earth's gravity, that could travel across the void of space, that could land on another world and return safely. This was not magic but engineering, not fantasy but careful planning and execution, not luck but the application of scientific knowledge and technical skill. Yet it seems almost magical nonetheless, this ability to reach beyond our planet and touch other worlds, to see the universe directly rather than only through telescopes, to become a spacefaring species capable of exploring the cosmos. The future of space exploration is uncertain but filled with possibilities. Humans may return to the moon, establishing permanent bases that allow sustained exploration and scientific research. Missions to Mars may follow, carrying astronauts on the months-long journey to the Red Planet, attempting to land on its surface and return home. Private companies may develop space tourism, making spaceflight accessible to people beyond professional astronauts. Mining operations may extract resources from asteroids. Telescopes in space may discover planets around distant stars where life might exist. All of these possibilities build on the foundation laid during the space race, on the technologies and capabilities and knowledge that were developed in that era of intense competition. But whatever happens in space in the decades and centuries ahead, the achievements of the space race era will remain historically significant, will remain a source of inspiration and pride, will remain a demonstration that humans can accomplish extraordinary things when we set our minds to it. The images of astronauts on the moon, the recordings of Gagarin's voice from orbit, the photographs of Earth from space, all of these will endure as monuments to an era when humanity first left its home planet and ventured into the cosmos. The night is deep now, and sleep is very near. You have traveled through this history, have witnessed the competition and achievement, the courage and sacrifice, the vision and determination that characterized the space race. You have learned about people and machines, about politics and technology, about how two nations racing each other to space ended up expanding the boundaries of what all humanity knew was possible. You can let these reflections settle gently now, can allow them to rest peacefully in your mind without creating tension or disturbing your rest. The space race happened decades ago, in a world different from ours in many ways. The people who made it happen, who designed the rockets and spacecraft, who flew into space and walked on the moon, who worked in mission control and assembly facilities, most of them are gone now or have grown old, their part in the story complete. What remains is the memory, the lessons, the achievements that became part of human history, the knowledge that we can reach beyond our world when we choose to do so. You are safe now, resting comfortably, breathing slowly and deeply. The story is complete, the journey through history finished. Tomorrow you will wake refreshed, carrying with you some knowledge of this remarkable chapter in human achievement, some understanding of how competition drove us to the moon and how that achievement changed how we see ourselves. But tonight, there is only peace, only rest, only the gentle descent into sleep that comes naturally when the body is relaxed and the mind is quiet. Let your breathing become even slower now, even deeper, each breath carrying you further into rest. Let your body sink completely into comfort, every muscle relaxed, every tension released. Let your mind drift gently, releasing thoughts as they arise, neither holding on to them nor pushing them away, simply allowing them to come and go like clouds across a peaceful sky. The story is complete now. The space race, with all its drama and achievement, all its lessons and significance, becomes part of your knowledge, part of your understanding of history, but it does not disturb your peace. It is a story from long ago, important to remember but not to worry about, meaningful but not threatening, part of the vast tapestry of human experience that you can appreciate without letting it trouble your rest. Sleep well now. Let go of everything. The space race taught us that we can reach for the stars, that we can accomplish things that seem impossible, that we can explore beyond our world. And you, lying here in safety and comfort, can rest knowing that the story ended well, that the achievements were real, that humanity proved capable of remarkable things. This knowledge can be a comfort, a source of wonder, but now it is time to simply rest. Good night, dear friend. Sleep peacefully. Sleep deeply. The space race is history now, its lessons preserved, its achievements remembered. And you can rest knowing that when humans dared to dream of space, dared to build machines to take us there, dared to leave our planet and explore the cosmos, we succeeded beyond what many thought possible. That success belongs to all of us, to all humanity, a reminder of what we can achieve together. Rest now. The night holds you safely. The world continues. And you, having learned and understood, can now release all these thoughts and simply sleep, peaceful, deep, and gentle sleep.